Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Molly Sarver. I am the Senior Land Use Planner with the Indiana County Office of Planning and Development. I act as Sustainability Coordinator to the Indiana County Sustainable Economic Development Task Force. To give you a little bit of background, the task force was started in April of 2017 by the Indiana County Commissioners. The commissioners at the time were Michael Baker, Rod Ruddick, and Shireen Hess. In September of 2017, the task force began to produce a report which analyzed different sustainable opportunities in Indiana County. They went through a process of engaging the community, asking people different questions, having people share concerns, and they identified four areas of interest for the task force. Those were the sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, building construction materials, and environmental restoration and stewardship. Within each of these four focuses, they looked for opportunities for economic development, workforce development, and citizen education. And in addition to recommendations that fell within those four focuses, they identified 5 executive recommendations, those being to create a new mission for the task force. Their initial mission was just to put together the report, but they wanted to continue acting on the recommendations that they identified in that report. They wanted to develop an Office of Sustainability. We do not have an office dedicated to sustainability yet, but I am a staff person who's dedicated to the task force. They also wanted to continue to hold annual sustainability summits. This would be our 4th sustainability summit. We've held one almost every year since 2017, with the exception being 2020. They wanted to incorporate more sustainability into long-range plans and municipal plans. And they also wanted to expand our broadband access. The report was revealed to the public in 2018 at their Sustainability Summit. If you want to see the presentations from our last summit, which was 2019, you can go to sustainableindianacounty.org, click on events, and then under events, you'll see a link to previous summit events. There you can find recordings of our presentations from 2017 as well as their slides. If you'd like to get more involved with the task force, or if you just are curious to see more about what we are and what we do, you can go to sustainableindianacounty.org. That's also where you can find more information about our Summit 4 webinar series. And if you want to contact us directly, you can go to sustainableindianacounty@gmail.com. All right. At the end of this webinar, you will automatically be put into a survey. We would appreciate it if you filled out that survey to let us know what you thought about this webinar and share recommendations you have for areas of improvement. You can also find a link to that survey on our Summit 4 webinar series webpage. So if you aren't able to fill out that survey at the end of this webinar, you can do that then. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our panelists, or have them introduce themselves to you. They'll tell you their name, their organization, and what they plan on talking about a little bit here today. We will be saving a question and answer segment for the end of their presentations, and that's when we'll have a more roundtable discussion. All right, so thank you, gentlemen. All right, so in order of your presentation, go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Great. Thank you, Molly, and thank you for the task force for having us here today. My name is Mark Szybist. I'm an attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. We're a national environmental organization, member-based. I lead our Pennsylvania energy policy work. I grew up in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and was working there, actually doing consumer bankruptcy work in the late 2000s when fracking started. And I became very interested in what was going on around that. Did a lot of fracking work for a few years and came to NRDC in 2015 to work on energy policy. So I do energy policy writ large, all in Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Henry McKay. I'm the Pennsylvania Program Director of a nonprofit organization called Solar United Neighbors. We're a national nonprofit. We help people go solar, join together, and fight for their energy rights. You may be familiar with us from the 2 Indiana County solar co-ops that we planned in the past few years. And I know I see some of the people here on this call were members of those co-ops and went solar through those programs. So it's nice to see some familiar names. And yeah, I'm based in Pittsburgh, and I'll be talking about solar energy today.
Good afternoon. My name's Ed Johnstonbaugh, and I'm with Penn State Extension, where I'm an education program associate working in the renewable energy space. I dabble in the public policy arena quite a bit, help craft some legislation over time, and really attempt to focus on getting it right. And that's what we'll be talking about in my brief presentation. Thank you.
And thank you to Molly and the task force for the opportunity to be here today. It's great to be with you all. My name is Robert Ruth. I'm an attorney with Clean Air Council. We're a member-based environmental nonprofit that is headquartered in Philadelphia. We have an office in Pittsburgh, and we've been operating and serving Pennsylvania since 1967. I'm coming to you from my home in Northwest Philadelphia, and plan to talk a bit about what Pennsylvania participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, will mean, what the process looks like, and what some of the projected impacts and benefits look to be. So great to be here.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. All right, Mark, if you want to take the floor.
Sure, thank you, Molly. I will attempt to share my screen. Please let me know if you don't get it. All right, can everybody see the PowerPoint that I have up?
Looking good on my
Great.
end.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to provide a sort of general introduction to why we need energy policy, and specifically why we need policy around greenhouse gases. And then my fellow panelists are going to get into some particular policies that are very important for Pennsylvania. All right. Sorry, okay, there we go. So in general, energy policy, and I think it's really interesting to recall, like, the very first definition of policy, if you go to a dictionary, it basically means the prudence and wisdom in the management of one's affairs. And I think something that's been happening over the last few years is a newfound sense of importance of policy in the United States generally. There were a lot of years when policy was diminished, downplayed, when the market and market solutions exclusively were touted as the only things we needed, and there didn't seem to be room for policy and governance. But I think we've learned in recent years that there really, really is that need, and there's probably no area where the evidence is strong for that as in energy. So the short of why we need energy policy at the very highest level is that we have a climate crisis. To avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to limit warming above pre-industrial levels by 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that's going to require some pretty drastic action and a lot of investments and a lot of policy by federal government, state government, and local governments as well. There have been a lot of analyses done to determine how do we get there. And they come to slightly different answers, but the rough outline is sort of consistent with the slide I'm showing here. And this is from a very recent study by Princeton University called Net Zero America that has 6 policy pillars, which again, in some form are the same ones that you'll see in a variety of studies that look out, how do we get greenhouse gas emissions out of our economy? And they are, 1, using efficient energy much more efficiently, while electrifying a lot of our end uses, including buildings and transportation. Doing a lot more with renewables while also building more transmission.
All right, we'll just move on to the next speaker for a few moments, and we'll come back to Mark. Henry, would you mind starting your presentation?
Sure. Let me get this started up. I'm also going to share my screen.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to be drilling into part of one of those pillars that Mark was in the middle of introducing, but generating our energy from, specifically the energy that powers our homes, generating from renewable sources, specifically solar energy. Now, just a quick Rooftop Solar 101, quick primer here. So a typical home that is solar powered, they put solar panels on the roof, maybe in their backyard or somewhere if they have the space. They remain connected to the electric grid. That is still the most common way that someone will go solar. They're not completely off grid. To do that, you need batteries. But by staying connected to the grid, that means they'll always have access to energy, whether or not their panels are generating. And typically in sunny parts of the year, in the summer, they're going to be generating more energy than they need. They'll use whatever they need, and their excess will go out, out into the grid. It'll be used by their neighbors, by somebody else, and then their electric meter is going to count that extra exported energy. They're going to be building up credits on their electric bill for this extra energy they sent back to the utility. And then in the winter, when you're probably not generating as much as you need from your solar panels, you're going to be able to spend down those banked credits from the summer as opposed to buying new energy from the utility. So it's kind of like rollover minutes used to work on cell phone bills. You build up a bank over the summer, you spend it down over the winter, and this is what lets you let you cover a year's worth of energy at a home, even though it's not evenly sunny all year. And this process, where your meter is essentially equipped to run both ways, measure your exported energy and whatever you're purchasing, is called net metering. It's a state law. It's policy in Pennsylvania, and it's one of the most important things that makes rooftop solar viable. And what that means effectively is someone who goes solar, their electric bills are dramatically lower because they're generating their own energy rather than buying it. And not only will they be able to pay off what they spent going solar with those energy savings, but they'll also be saving thousands of dollars more on top of that. So over the 25 to 30 life of a solar system, a solar home will be saving thousands of dollars even after paying for their system. So it's a strong financial incentive to go solar. It does take a while to realize those benefits, though, and that's one of the obstacles that keeps more people from going solar. And also, just to note that solar is really popular in Pennsylvania. This is some data from a study from the Center for Rural Pennsylvania Attitudinal Survey from 2019, and they were asking people which of the following options holds the greatest promise for addressing Pennsylvania's energy demands in the next 5 years. And clearly, the most popular answer was investing in renewable energy resources such as solar and wind. And that was true for both urban and rural respondents. You see this similarly when it's broken down based on party lines, but renewable energy, like solar, is generally really popular, and people want policy to support it and make it more accessible to more people. Now, one really crucial policy in Pennsylvania that influences how much solar there is, and specifically how much, and also how much rooftop solar there is called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, the AEPS. This is a law that says that electric utilities must get 18% of their electricity from renewable sources. Alternative sources. Not all of them are actually renewable. And they must do so by May of this year. Within that 18%, 0.5% to 0.5% must come specifically from solar. This is what's known as the solar carve-out. Now, our electric utilities in Pennsylvania, they're deregulated, which means we've separated the distribution of electricity from the generation of electricity. So your electric company doesn't own any of their own generating assets. They don't own power plants. So the way they get to this target is they buy credits from people who do have these power plants or solar. So if you have solar on your home, every time you generate 1,000 kilowatt hours of energy, or 1 megawatt hour, you earn something called a solar renewable energy credit, an SREC. Utilities are buying these SRECs from you to meet that 0.5% solar carve-out target. These are sold on a market. Their pricing is dynamic, so depending on how much demand there is for SRECs and what the supply is, the price will go up and down. The end result is that the seller, the owner of the SRECs who's selling them, they get money. This helps lower the net cost of going solar, and more solar gets installed. Now, our target, 0.5% by 2021, is it sounds low. It is low, and for that reason, we have fairly low value SRECs. There's not a lot of demand to buy them from utilities, and as a result, the price is low. So you can see this is the SREC price for Pennsylvania. I think it's as of a few weeks ago when I made this slide. But you can see ours are at $23. Ohio, which not that long ago really weakened their portfolio standard law, has a $9 SREC. And then states with much more aggressive solar energy targets, Maryland, New Jersey, and DC, have much higher SREC prices. And that means that somebody going solar in those places is going to see a much faster return on investment. That means more people are going solar. So this portfolio standard policy is a really effective way to grow the amount of solar and ensure that the people who are making the investment to build that solar share in the economic benefits that come with it. And I should point out that this SREC revenue that you get if you have solar, that's on top of your energy savings you're already getting. Your electric bill is going lower, and then also you're getting this check for your SRECs. So as I said, this target plateaus in May of this year. And that means that if we don't update the law and set a new higher solar energy goal, the demand for those SRECs is going to continue to stay low, and even it's going to fall as utilities just have to maintain this 0.5% level rather than keep ratcheting it up every year. So that means it's going to further hurt the economics of going solar at a time when we really should be knocking down roadblocks to make it easier for more people to benefit from solar. Now, another roadblock that prevents people from benefiting from solar energy is the fact that they may not own their home. They may be renters, so you can't put solar on their roof. They may have a shady roof. They may not be able to afford the upfront cost or access financing that will help them pay for solar. So there's a large portion of people, maybe even half of all energy users, who just can't go solar for one of these reasons. And that's where a policy called community solar comes into play. This is where you build a large offsite array, and you have multiple people subscribe to a share of the output of that array. So you get your electric bill reduced from your community solar subscription, but you don't have to physically put it on your property. So this means that renters can do it. It means people with bad roofs can do it. My roof is shaded, well shaded by an oak tree. And so this is something I would like to subscribe to someday. But we have to pass a law in Pennsylvania to actually enable this, to make it possible. And that's something that's been in the works for a while. We're waiting for a new community solar bill to be introduced this year as well. This is one of those unique energy policies that also can unite urban and rural voters because it offers benefits to both communities. So for the subscribers, which they can come from anywhere, but urban areas with a really high percentage of renters, with people living in multifamily housing, with more shady roofs, tend to have a lot of subscribers living there, potential subscribers living there. So it lowers these barriers to them going solar. It lets them save money and lets them support more solar in their state. And then for the landowners where these solar arrays, these community solar arrays are hosted, they're earning steady lease payments from the solar developer. These are anywhere between like $800 and $1,000 per acre per year. So it's good, reliable income. It's the kind of thing that can put otherwise marginal land to good productive use, and also for a farm that's struggling to stay in business, like a lot of Pennsylvania farms, this is a great form of supplemental revenue that can help keep the rest of the farm in business. And then there are all these other cool things you can do to create co-benefits from that installation. Like you can plant pollinator habitat, you can plant native wildflowers and grasses amongst the solar panels, create habitat for native pollinators, which could even give a yield boost if there are pollinated crops located right next door. Or other things to be good stewards of the land underneath those solar panels. So those are the two policies I wanted to highlight in Pennsylvania. This right here, this is a local Indiana County residential solar array too, just to show what a ground mount array looks like. But happy to answer any questions towards the end of this.
Thank you so much for that, Henry. We actually have Mark back with us. Mark, would you like to finish your presentation?
Sure, and I sincerely apologize for the technical difficulties before. I am going to, I'll try to share my screen again now.
And if you'd like to, I can also share it.
Okay, I think I can do it. Switch to a different internet source here. So is that visible?
Yes.
Great, okay.
Awesome.
So I'm not sure exactly where I cut off before, but there are a ton of analyses and studies that have been done to figure out how do we change the way that we use energy in order to eliminate greenhouse gases. And you'll see these different strategies mixed up in different ways, arranged in different pillars. But basically what it boils down to is we have to use energy much more efficiently. We have to electrify a lot of end uses, like replacing hot water heaters that now are powered by gas with electric hot water heaters and electric vehicles instead of gasoline and diesel vehicles. We have to generate a lot more of our electricity from renewables, including solar, as Henry just explained. We have to build new high voltage transmission to bring renewable power from where it's sort of most abundant. And in the United States, that's like in the Midwest for wind or offshore. We have to bring it from those places to the places where the demand is greatest. We have to use more bioenergy to replace end uses like heavy duty vehicles and jets, where it's going to be harder, if not impossible, to electrify. We have to capture a lot of the carbon that we are emitting because it can't be completely eliminated. We have to reduce non-CO2 emissions, and in Pennsylvania, methane, especially from oil gas activities, and agriculture is the biggest. And we have to enhance our use of land sinks, forest and soil that can store a lot of the carbon that we're producing. And this is just the same sort of pillars in a graphic form: efficiency, electrification, renewables, land sinks, and sucking carbon out of the air, carbon capture, and using biofuels to replace heavy duty uses. This is going to be difficult, but it is absolutely feasible. The technologies certainly need to improve in a lot of places, but so many of the technologies already exist right now, and it's just a matter of reorienting the economy to make sure that we're pursuing those and not working at odds. And efficiency is really a huge one. Pennsylvania has an efficiency statute, Act 129, that requires electric utilities to run efficiency programs. But it's an example of a law like the AEPS that was adopted quite a long time ago and can be significantly improved. I'll just sort of run through these quickly. There's a lot we can do, but we know how to do it for mostly. One other thing I wanted to stress is that it's not just a matter of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. We also have to do it in a way that's equitable. And I think this has really come into sharp focus during the COVID-19 pandemic and all the sort of economic and other hardship, health, safety, well-being that people are experiencing. And I just included on this slide some of the top line, just a few data points for how, for like the last few decades, the American economy has not been working that well for most Americans. We've seen a lot of the economic gains go to the very top, And we really need to adopt a lot of other policies outside of the energy space to create a fairer economy that make this transition easier. Meanwhile, we have to make sure that when we are pursuing energy policies, those policies are equitable themselves. Then I have a few slides that just show some of what states are doing. A lot of states have established goals for greenhouse gas reductions, including Pennsylvania. And Robert's going to speak to RGGI, which is the sort of foremost Pennsylvania policy for implementing that goal. Efficiency standards, I just mentioned, Pennsylvania again, the relevant statute is Act 129 of 2008, which is pretty old and can certainly be strengthened and updated. Henry talked about the alternative energy portfolio standard in Pennsylvania and how that also is pretty weak at this stage and really needs to be changed and strengthened. And then I just wanted to flag that it's not just a matter of states. And of course, Indiana County is doing its share to try to figure out how we decarbonize the economy. But we're seeing an increasing number of city and county and other local governments make their own climate action commitments. So I will stop there. Happy to answer questions about those issues later, and especially about carbon capture, which is something that I was thinking about focusing on. There's a hearing on the Pennsylvania Senate Environmental Resources Energy Committee yesterday. But I will stop there. And again, sorry for having to break up the presentation in two pieces.
Not a problem at all, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, we'll move on to Ed. Oh, there we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. As I talked to the presenters at the beginning, I'm talking about an issue that, of course, I'm passionate about these issues, but you know, establishing and maintaining prudent public policy is at the heart of what we're talking about today. What we need to make sure, though, is that the bureaus or the agencies that are entrusted with moving the policy forward, with enacting the law, are up to the task, and they can be trusted and follow through with the goals of the legislation. So being concise in your directive, the expectation and the outcome of any proposed law, rule, or regulation is critical, because when it's handed off, it's subject to interpretation. So as was described earlier, in 2014, we passed an alternative energy portfolio law, and that law established what a customer generator definition was. And I have posted here the language of the original law. It was when the renewable energy generating system is intended primarily to offset all or part of the customer generator's requirements for electricity. Pretty stringent, pretty limited, and the legislature recognized that. In 3 short years, they came back with a policy adjustment to that, and that policy stated when any portion of the electricity generated by an alternative energy generation system is used to offset part or all of the customer generator's requirements for electricity. So they recognized that their original definition was tight and restrictive, but the agency entrusted with enacting the original law and the amended law in 2007 wasn't up to the task, wasn't taking to heart the challenge that they'd been given. And so in the time that pursued, in an attempt to constrict back the growth of renewables in the state, they enacted this following definition of what a non-utility was. And the goal here was to define any customer generator that produced more electricity than they consumed in a year would be considered a utility. And so this was their original definition. Now we recognize, many people in the industry, what had gone on with the enacting agency, the Public Utility Commission, and over the course of 15 years, there's been a battle in this state to bring the Public Utility Commission in line with what the original law intended. And so I have, the language shown here that the Public Utility Commission adopted, but the process of correcting improperly enacted legislation is incredibly difficult. So when we look here in February of this year, after proceeding through rounds of challenges with the Public Utility Commission itself, going to the Commonwealth Court and getting a ruling in favor of correcting what the Public Utility Commission had done, and finally ending up in the Supreme Court almost 15 years after the enactment of the law. Finally, there's been corrective action, or a correcting of the law of the land, as is shown in these two statements from the Commonwealth Court. I'll just direct you to the second statement there. Moreover, the PUC's restrictions run contrary to the purpose of the AEPS Act. The purpose of the AEPS Act was to encourage the development of energy generated from renewable and environmentally beneficial sources. So this is the Commonwealth Court's language, recognizing that the Public Utility Commission had left the ranch and gone astray in their interpretation of the law. Now, our public policy is deeply imprinted with 15 years of improper application of the law. So we have, if you look in any published regulations of the regulated utilities in the states, you will find that the rules and regulations that have been adopted are contrary to what the Commonwealth Court has ruled and what the Supreme Court has affirmed. So now, not only have we lived under this restriction for 15 years, we have to try to undo or unweave from the fabric of our public policy this misinterpretation of the law. And as was mentioned in Henry's talk, we have attempted to get to 0.5% of solar, for example. It's highly likely that by June 1st, we won't be there. And you have to ask yourself how public policy can be so befuddled and misinterpreted that we didn't meet such a minuscule goal in a over 15-year period of time. I'm happy to talk with anybody about that subject and others, and you can find me at that email address below. I'll turn the podium back to you, Molly.
Thank you very much for that, Ed. And now we will be moving on to Robert.
Great. Thanks, Molly. Let me get my show up and running here. There we go. Is that coming through?
That is coming through.
All right. Thanks again. So one major energy policy and one of the most effective policy solutions to begin addressing the problem of greenhouse gas emissions is to put a price on carbon. You may have heard some say that in Pennsylvania, we already have a price on carbon and that it is zero. Electric power plants in Pennsylvania effectively do not pay for, do not incorporate the cost of the carbon pollution they emit into the atmosphere. Instead, those costs have been externalized, and the people of Pennsylvania have certainly been paying a price for those emissions reflected in public health impacts and climate-related infrastructure damage. So in October of 2019, Governor Wolf signed an executive order that directed the Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, to develop a rulemaking package to control carbon dioxide pollution from our state's power plants. In Pennsylvania, our power plants account for roughly 1/3 of our overall greenhouse gas pollution. These regulations will establish a CO2 budget trading program and allow Pennsylvania to participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. So what is RGGI? Governors in the various RGGI participating states came together in agreement back in 2005, and the program has been in effect since 2009. We're now up to 11 participating states, with Virginia setting up its state program on January 1st. All of them are Pennsylvania neighbors in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. And RGGI is a cap and invest, or emissions trading program, where each of the states involved has set up its own CO2 budget trading program under its respective state law. And the program design elements are sufficiently similar that regulated power plants can trade allowances across state lines. And the fundamental structure of an emissions trading program like this is that it's a market-based approach to controlling pollution by providing economic incentives. So each regulated entity, again, in this case, it's power plants, must obtain an allowance, a limited permission to pollute, for each ton of carbon that it emits annually. And the vast majority of these CO2 allowances issued by each RGGI state are distributed through quarterly regional CO2 allowance auctions. Power plant operators and investors submit bids to obtain allowances at auction, with the market determining the price of an allowance. Those allowances can then be bought and sold in a secondary market, and the number of allowances available declines predictably over time, which is what drives emission reductions. In Pennsylvania, these rules are authorized by the State Air Pollution Control Act. This statute directs the department, DEP, to establish various conditions under which pollution is permissible and to establish emission fees. The proposed RGGI rule accomplishes both these tasks, again, through an auction and allowance mechanism. Power plants must obtain either allowances for each ton of pollution, or alternatively, those sources could choose to reduce their emissions. And while the department could set emissions fees directly, they could simply decide what fee they would like to charge for carbon emissions. The department has instead chosen to use this auction system to distribute the majority of allowances, which allows the market to discover the minimum appropriate fee to achieve targeted emission limits. And to be clear, this use of a cap and invest system is not a new approach in Pennsylvania. Similar programs have successfully been used to reduce the sulfur dioxide emissions that caused acid rain since the mid-1990s, and the NOx emissions that contribute to ozone smog. There's also a NOx budget trading program that's already been on the books for years here. So this program is projected to have some significant impacts in Pennsylvania. An estimated 188 million tons of carbon reductions by 2030, with co-benefit reductions of NOx and sulfur dioxide, which you can see on the screen here. Those monetized health benefits add up to $6 billion. And the auction and fee framework is projected to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in proceeds annually in Pennsylvania. Looking at the most recent allowance clearing price at the RGGI auction that was held last week among the 11 participating states, If that clearing price held over the course of a full year, that would translate to over $500 million coming into the state next year that can be used to reinvest in Pennsylvania businesses and communities. DEP is currently holding a number of roundtable discussions with different stakeholder groups to come up with a more holistic plan for these RGGI investments. And DEP is also contracted with a group known as the Delta Institute to engage with impacted communities and workers to identify ways to ensure that there is a just and equitable transition for all Pennsylvania residents. And this revenue stream is really important given the ongoing energy transition that has been happening in the Commonwealth for a while now. We have seen 19 coal-fired power plants in Pennsylvania close since 2005, and that's obviously without the state participating in RGGI. That's been driven by market forces. To be specific, the abundant supply of another cheaper fossil fuel, shale gas. The gas boom in Pennsylvania, which began about a dozen years ago and is driven by a process known as hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which Mark mentioned earlier, it has seen gas-fired power plants replace older coal-fired plants that are struggling to compete economically. And now at the smokestack, this has resulted in fewer carbon emissions. But there are diminishing returns in just replacing one fossil fuel source with another over time, particularly with the goals that we need to get to by the end of this decade and again by mid-century to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And again, to be clear, a future without any policy change, where Pennsylvania does not establish this CO2 budget trading program, will see gas plants continue to replace the remaining coal plants, likely replace the 4 remaining nuclear power plants in Pennsylvania. And fracked gas will come to monopolize the energy market in Pennsylvania over the coming decade, which also means that workers will continue to be displaced, but without any revenue stream to support them or their communities. That outcome will certainly be harmful from an emissions perspective if gas plants replace nuclear plants, but it'll also have negative impacts for consumers and the regional electric grid. So that is what the status quo, if it continues to play out, looks like without any policy change. So there's frankly a lot more to be said about RGGI, but I will leave it at that for now. The state rulemaking process will continue to play out over the course of this year. There was a lengthy public comment period held in the past few months, and at the moment, DEP is preparing responses to all the thousands of comments submitted. They're considering possible changes to the proposal, and we're likely to see a draft final form rule made public in the not too distant future. And there are a number of statutes that govern the state rulemaking process, which will require votes later on this year by the Environmental Quality Board and the Independent Regulatory Review Commission. And there is consideration by the state legislature as well under the state's Regulatory Review Act. So there are many steps that remain in the process over the course of this year and heading into 2022. I'm happy to take any questions you may have, but I just really want to reiterate how much I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today and to speak about this. So just thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Robert. At this time, we will open up the floor to questions. For those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, we are watching the comment section. So if you want to comment with a question, we will try to pass that on to the speakers. So I'll give our attendees a few moments to drop some questions in the Q&A. And I will be looking at the Facebook post. I suppose to start with, Robert, whenever it comes to RGGI, I'm sure you touched on it a little bit in your presentation. But have you heard of any main concerns for how the money that would be coming out of the tax on carbon would be redistributed to communities in Pennsylvania? And is that model the same in each state that it's adopted in?
Sure. Have I heard concerns about how those reinvestments will be made? Well, it's a topic of great interest, given the sheer amount of funds that are projected to come into the state coffers. So, like I said, right now, the department is having a number of discussions with different stakeholder groups, the agriculture community, commercial and industrial sources, groups that advocate for low-income ratepayers, trying to get a sense of how best to spend some of the proceeds that will come in as a result of this program. And there are some key differences between the kind of fees that are being established under the RGGI program and what a carbon tax would actually be. There are important hallmarks to a tax that are not present in the current regulations. But I think it is in terms of how investments are made in the other RGGI participating states. Most of the proceeds have gone to investments in energy efficiency programs and renewable energy programs, which help drive down consumer electric bills. But each state, is able to make its own investment decisions under the authorities granted to it in their respective state laws. So, for example, in Pennsylvania right now, I mentioned these regulations are authorized by the state's Air Pollution Control Act. That same law states that emission fees, the proceeds from emission fees, must be deposited in something known as the Clean Air Fund, which is established under that same state law. And the Clean Air Fund, monies that are deposited there, must be spent on uses that eliminate air pollution. That is a statutory restriction that is currently in place in terms of what DEP can reinvest the RGGI proceeds on. So if we wanted to have a little more flexibility on the spending side, we could have additional legislation. There was a bill that was introduced last session, and we anticipate something similar potentially being introduced this session that would enhance some of the department's ability to reinvest some of the RGGI proceeds, including potentially other states I know have spent money to offer assistance to consumers who are experiencing any electric bill impacts, direct customer assistance on bills. And that is something it may not be possible to tie that, have a nexus to elimination of air pollution, just direct customer bill assistance. So that would be something where additional legislative authorization could help on the spending side. And the governor just put out his budget proposal last month, which includes his vision for how he'd like to see the RGGI monies be allocated. And part of that is establishing what he's called the Energy Communities Trust Fund, and would require additional legislative authorization. So there's each RGGI state is free to make its own choices with the proceeds that come in, and Pennsylvania currently is guided by what is laid out in the Air Pollution Control Act in terms of where those monies will go and how those monies can be spent.
I think you're on mute, Molly.
Thank you for catching that. Our next question is, do you foresee any new federal policy coming from the new administration in DC that could leverage state policy on carbon emissions? I think that would go towards Robert.
I would anticipate, so under the Obama administration, there were federal regulations put in place, which some of you may be familiar with. It was known as the Clean Power Plan. It gave states a lot of flexibility in terms of how to achieve emission reductions, but it applied to electric power plants. and sought to reduce those emissions over time. The Trump administration enacted its own regulations that rolled back that policy effort. That has now been, which was known as the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, that has now been struck down by the DC Circuit, a federal court of appeals, and has been remanded to the EPA to address some of the court's findings in that decision. So I would anticipate EPA coming up with new federal regulations to address emissions from the power sector. It will presumably, again, offer a lot of individual state flexibility in terms of how to achieve those emission reductions. Pennsylvania participation in RGGI, the CO2 budget trading program, will likely serve as a compliance pathway in order to be in compliance with the forthcoming federal regulations. And it's a good way for Pennsylvania to chart its own course and get ahead of what is likely coming down from the federal government, as opposed to potentially waiting and delaying. That we've heard that as a possible alternative. We should wait for the federal government to act, which in the policy realm leads to a lot of uncertainty and leads to the possibility that the federal government dictates how Pennsylvania needs to achieve emission reductions. So I do anticipate that, and I think that Pennsylvania participation in RGGI is not just consistent with what's likely coming from the federal government, but will be complementary and beneficial to Pennsylvania.
Thank you for sharing your perspective on that. Our next question is, would Mark elaborate on the feasibility of carbon capture?
Sure. So, as I sort of laid out in that slide deck, carbon capture is one of the pillars that we're going to need to really decarbonize the economy. And the Senate Environmental Resources and Energy Committee had a big hearing on it yesterday. I think the most important thing to understand regarding carbon capture is that where we will need it most is in the industrial sector. The hearing yesterday in the state Senate focused on the power sector, namely on whether we could capture emissions from coal plants and gas plants and thereby sort of preserve the use of those assets to generate power. It may be that, we need carbon capture with some fossil plants for a relatively small amount of generation, because if you were to build so that you're generating 100% of your electricity from renewables, that last 10% could be more expensive than really makes sense. And for that last 10%, we might want fossil plants with carbon capture. It could be cheaper and therefore a sort of better deal. But it's going to be limited. And the cost of retrofitting existing coal plants and gas plants would frankly be enormous, much greater than the cost of generating electricity with renewables, with battery storage, and new transmission capabilities. Where we really see a role for carbon capture in the future is in industry. And the three biggest sources of industrial emissions are steel, cement, and petrochemicals. And there are potential solutions in each of those areas for reducing emissions. The one that's sort of getting the most attention right now in the Northeast is cement. And cement is the main constituent of concrete. It's a very carbon intensive process to manufacture it. But both New York and New Jersey, and I think some other states around the country, are looking into using the purchasing power of the state to sort of drive lower emission concrete. All states buy a lot of concrete for road construction and other infrastructure projects. And if the state can say, we want that concrete to be lower in emissions, in part through carbon capture technologies, that can be a really great way to drive the technology moving forward. Meanwhile, there's a ton of R&D that still needs to be done on carbon capture. The DCNR is doing a lot of it in the state, but the needs are so great that we really need the federal government, the Department of Energy, to lead that work.
Thank you, Mark, for that. All right, our next question is, do we have any plans for refrigerant policy? If we are going to electrify home heating, that means heat pumps and current R410 is a very powerful GH gas. I'm not sure if I butchered reading that or not.
I can take a stab at that just because I think I'm not familiar with that particular gas, but I think the general category of pollutant is hydrofluorocarbons. And there was a part of the big energy law that was passed in late December. Well, it was bigger than energy, but there were a lot of energy policies in it. One of the parts of that was a policy to eliminate the use of HFCs in a lot of refrigerants, because there are alternative chemicals that don't have the potent greenhouse gas effects that HFCs do. So I'm not positive that that's what the question is referring to, but if it is HFCs, there is now a federal policy that hopefully will drive the elimination of that kind of pollutant.
Thank you, Mark. And if anyone asking questions doesn't feel that we've elaborated enough on questions, feel free to submit a new question asking for clarification. All right, the next question is, our local state representative has been vocal about arguing against RGGI, with his reasoning being that he is representative of his constituency, which relies on jobs, by keeping status quo. Without an immediate replacement for jobs income, and the argument that there is currently no adequate replacement for power plants for the East Coast, let alone Western PA, how can workers be assured they won't become merely welfare recipients?
I mean, that's a very fair question. It's it is important that the department listen to communities that are going to be impacted by these regulations. There is no reason why we cannot both confront, the threat of climate change, but and not have it come at the expense of communities that, in some cases it may be environmental justice communities, groups that have been disproportionately burdened by carbon pollution, nor from those communities that have been dependent on, for property tax revenue, the facilities that have been, the coal-fired power plants that have been operating for decades now. I think it's important to just acknowledge the fact that while it would be nice to have a constructive conversation about different solutions for say, districts in Indiana County, what we have mostly heard proposed is simply to block participation in RGGI. And again, if we were to do that, that is not a realistic, there is no realistic policy solution. We are instead just going to see a continued domination and growth of fracked gas and gas-fired power plants, many of which are projected to come online in the next few years and be replacing some of these older, uneconomic coal-fired plants with or without RGGI participation. And in the instance without RGGI participation, there is no revenue stream to provide any assistance. It is what has been happening to the communities that have lost 19 coal-fired power plants over the past 15 years here in Pennsylvania. They've been left to fend for themselves. So it's critical that we make wise decisions with RGGI reinvestments, and do so in a way that provides, widespread broad benefits for all those in Pennsylvania. But when the alternative approach is to simply do nothing, it's failing to account for what that status quo means for communities that, again, have been experiencing the ongoing energy transition in Pennsylvania. So I believe that through participation in RGGI, we will not only be taking a major step forward to potentially address our emissions and deal with the climate crisis, but do so in a way that, again, you're using market forces to try and find the minimum fee appropriate to achieve emissions limits. There's a lot of flexibility baked into the RGGI programs that have been operating in these other states and that Pennsylvania is trying to structure here. So it is an important tool, and if we want to discuss how best to ensure that workers don't merely become welfare recipients, I think you need to we need to have some constructive engagement again from the legislature, and not simply standing up and saying we're going to block this.
Thank you. And I regret not saying this earlier, but we are planning on having a webinar series, or not webinar series, but a webinar specifically on how our shifts in energy industry are impacting our local workforce. Our tentative date for that is going to be March 31st at noon. That's a Wednesday. That still may change, but that is the date that we have set. And currently we have lined up for that presentation representatives from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, a representative from the local Boilermakers Union, and also, just to make sure I'm getting their titles right, I believe someone from PA Coal. It's a local lobbying group for coal, and we'll also have other representatives as well. So please stay tuned for that because we would like to continue this discussion of energy policy and its effect on our workforce. All right, we have another question. Does it seem like Reggie will happen given so much pushback from different groups?
I certainly hope so. I believe that Pennsylvania is better off in the world where this CO2 budget trading program is established than without. The department has again, the statutory authority to move forward with this. So I think there will be efforts, most likely, there will be efforts again in the General Assembly to attempt to block participation in RGGI, and there's legislation that has been introduced that would go further than that. It would actually strip DEP of its authority to take any action to control carbon pollution, which is frankly, it would represent a radical step backwards for state policy. So I don't want to prognosticate too much, but I am hopeful that RGGI will happen, and the state's regulatory process sets out a number of steps that still need to take place over this year in order to get this finalized by 2022. But there's going to be vocal and sustained opposition from some of the same sources who we've been hearing from since over the past year and a half, since this rulemaking process began.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted again. Thank you. Ed, you had focused on the importance of making sure that what policy we have is implemented correctly, or written in a way that it will be implemented correctly. Do you have any insight on concerns we might have for RGGI and its implementation, or recommendations for language that should be used to make sure it's implemented in the way that's most effective or most beneficial to our communities?
Well, what I see happening is, voluntary carbon markets are being created as we speak. So there is industry reaction to, the carbon issue. Being a university-oriented person, I can tell you that universities and colleges across the country are looking at this issue. So as the wheels are in motion already. As was described, the origins of the regional greenhouse gas initiative date back to the middle of 2005, and so we've had more than 15 years of trial run, or fine tuning of the mechanisms that other states have enacted. My primary concern is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow syndrome, where the promise of this over $500 million cache of funds becomes very enticing to do a lot of other things that may or may not be on goal with what RGGI had intended. So, you know, in a world where we need stopgap measures to plug budget holes, that cash reserve is going to be very enticing to legislators and the government in general to overspend or outspend other obligations with the idea that we can drop back and tap the Reggie funds and then you know, just put it back later, because that never happens. And we've seen this played out again and again. So the kind of focusing in on what I'm thinking here is that to keep people honest, the legislation has to be somehow, or there has to be legislative action that is ironclad at the purpose and use of those funds.
Thank you. And
I could add, you know, this as Reggie rolls out and these other policies we've talked about, you know, there's lots of opportunities for public participation and input throughout that. And it's really important, especially with something like Reggie that will affect Indiana County so directly, that people in Indiana County have an opportunity to be a part of crafting the solution. So it can be really obtuse and unclear, you know, how this plays out at the regulatory and eventually legislative level. But I know, you know, our organization, Solar United Neighbors, Clean Air Council, NRDC, you know, we're here to help you engage in those processes, whether it's submitting public comment, talking to your legislators in a way where you can be informed and, you know, applying your own pressure in an effective way. So, you know, it would be a problem if this was all implemented and, you know, without input from people in communities like Indiana County. So I want you all to make sure you feel empowered to be a part of this.
Henry, do you have any recommendations for people who have concerns about specific language in the policies, or even if they aren't familiar with the document itself, want to make sure that specific interests are being attended to?
You know, that might be a better question for Robert, for if there are particular opportunities coming up. But, you know, I think just, you know, signing onto the newsletters of our various organizations, we're talking about this, we're helping you understand it and letting you know where there's an opportunity to speak out to people in power about it.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Henry. So I mentioned there was a public comment period held earlier that closed in mid-January, but lasted for several months. And under state law, the department has to read and respond to each of the comments that got submitted during that comment period. And there were tens of thousands of commenters, you know, who weighed in. So the department, I mentioned that they're currently working on responses to those comments right now. But this process is going to play out over the next 9 months. So even if they may not be officially required to respond to your comment in writing, if you deliver it now, you are empowered to make your point of view heard, weigh into DEP, weigh into the governor's office, weigh in with your state and local elected officials. They are actively considering now how best on the spending side, on the investment side. They are convening these roundtable discussions with different groups. And I don't think I mentioned the outcome of that process is going to be a spending plan that they put in writing and will solicit comment again from the public. It is not going to be as going through the same process as the regulation itself, which is governed by multiple state laws. But nonetheless, later this year, they will be putting out again for public comment their plan for how to make Reggie reinvestments work best for Pennsylvania. So it is, that's all to say, while the public comment period has closed, they are actively encouraging people to weigh in and make your voices heard because of just how widespread the impacts will be from Reggie. But that goes to all the other policies that have been mentioned here today, many of which will be going through the state legislature. If your voices matter a lot to your elected officials, whether it seems like that all the time or not, your voices matter.
Yeah, and there's never not a good time to go to your elected official and make your opinion known. You know, the question earlier was like, will RGGI actually go through? And I think Robert addressed that well. But, you know, for me, the question is, will the legislature start to engage on this? Will the legislature say, okay, here's the work we need to do. How do we create the jobs to meet that work? You know, that's partly what RGGI is about. And again, as Robert explained, there are ways that would be good to spend some of this money that the DEP can't do because the existing legislation does not authorize that. So will the legislature step into that void and say, yes, we need to do this, but we also need to make sure we're putting the money to the best and highest use?
Thank you. And just, you know, for the record, for people who might be interested in looking more into that issue, Mark, can you think of any particular policies that are restrictive when it comes to what kind of funding can be, or where funding can be allocated from RGGI or other similar programs?
Yeah, I think that you know the big limitation right now is that under this clean air fund that Robert described, all the money has to be spent on investments that reduce air pollution. And those are obviously the kind of investments we mostly want to see. But there's a universe of investments that are really important, but don't reduce air pollution. And that includes assistance for communities that are dealing with transition from coal plants, that are going to see their tax bases reduced because coal plants close, that are going to have trouble funding their schools. You know, those are obviously super important concerns that need to be addressed. There are ways to address them outside of RGGI for sure, but RGGI presents an immediate opportunity to help address those needs. So, and the other, you know, again, is like environmental justice communities, communities of people of color and lower income people who traditionally have borne more pollution impacts than other communities. Again, there are things that can be done in those communities that may not directly reduce air pollution, but that are really important to do.
Thank you very much. And while we're on the topic of legislation, Henry, would you mind, if you can remember it off the top of your head, would you be able to share the bill numbers for the House, and I believe it's also in the Senate, on community solar? Because I believe that's a bipartisan movement, isn't it?
Yeah, so the community solar bills that were introduced last session have expired because the legislative session ended, so they need to be reintroduced. So we're still waiting for those bills to be reintroduced. It's likely going to be in a very different form than it was last time. So we're trying to understand what that new legislation will look like. It's looking like it will likely still be introduced, at least in the House, by the same Republican Representative Aaron Coffer. And then similarly with the portfolio standard, we're expecting, there have been co-sponsor memos out saying we intend to introduce legislation to update the portfolio standard. And that has so far come from, also bipartisan, from Representative Laughlin, from a Republican from Erie, and Art Haywood, a Democrat from Philadelphia. So we're seeing, you know, bipartisan action on the horizon for both of these issues. It is something that it's not just one party working on these issues. And I know if you're part of our newsletter, we'll make a lot of noise and make sure you know about both of those bills once they appear.
All right, thank you very much. And as I draw this webinar to a close, I would like to remind everyone to please stay on if you can, just to fill out the survey, or find our survey at sustainableindianacounty.org. Go to our summit page and you will find the survey there. I'd additionally like to advertise that tomorrow we are holding another webinar. This one will focus on local experiences regarding solar. So we'll have some members of the solar co-op speaking to their experiences with adopting solar on their property. And while we're talking about the different options of energy production that are available to people in Pennsylvania, I would like to remind people that we had a wonderful presentation by Ed Johnstonbaugh earlier this week, speaking about biodigesters, similar to what Mark mentioned with industrial carbon capture, using these byproducts, which are currently just getting wasted or forming pollution. Biodigesters capture that waste and turn that waste into energy. So, it's a wonderful presentation and very informative. Again, at the end of the month, tentatively Wednesday, March 31st, we will be holding a webinar on shifts in energy industries' impact on our local workforce. Do we have any other closing comments from the panelists? All right, thank you so much, gentlemen. This was a wonderful webinar. Thank you everyone who was attending either here or on Facebook. We look forward to working with you all in the future, and yeah, have a wonderful Thursday.
Thank you.
All right,
Thanks,
thank you.
Molly. And thanks everyone for spending part of your afternoon with us.
Yes. Bye-bye.